A middle-aged man named Ivan, who lived in Estonia, was walking in this forest looking for firewood. In general, his exposure to this forest was just on the fringes. But that day, he was just really having a hard time finding good firewood. And so at some point, he decided to just walk deeper into the woods to see if he would have luck in there. And after walking for nearly an hour, he sees up ahead there is very clearly a clearing and then a chain link fence. He has no idea what this is, but he's obviously curious. And as he's getting closer to it, the trees around him are beginning to thin out. And suddenly, before he even reaches the fence, he gets a very clear view of what's on the other side. And it's this huge multi-story building that almost looks like a factory or some sort of government facility. And so Ivan is totally intrigued by this. And so he walks right up to the fence and he tries to look and figure out what this building is. And then he notices there's obviously graffiti on the sides of this building, and the doors and windows appeared to be boarded up. And so this building is clearly abandoned. And the first thought that goes through Ivan's head is scrap metal. Times were tough for Ivan and his family. And so he and his two brothers, they all lived together. They would go out and they would steal scrap metal and sell it for a little bit of extra cash to make ends meet and provide for their big family. He turned around and began hustling back towards town. He rounded up his two brothers, and they all very excitedly agreed that that night they would go right back out there and see what they could find. And so around 9 p.m. that night, the brothers met up and they had flashlights and a set of bolt cutters, and they headed into the nearby forest and they lifted their flashlights up and they scanned through the fence all over the property. And when they didn't see anyone, they climbed up and over this fence. And when they got up to this building, they confirmed it definitely looked like it was abandoned, except all of the doors and windows were sealed. They were not going to get inside this building. And so feeling totally dejected, they turn and they start walking back towards the fence they hopped in on. And as they're walking along, off to the far right side of the property, there is this small shack that they had not noticed on their way in. And so the brothers look at each other and they're like, maybe there's scrap metal in there. And when they get there, they discover it's only secured with a simple padlock on a wooden door. And so they get their bolt cutters, they pop off the lock, they open up the door, they move something on the ground, and it reveals this stairwell that leads into this underground bunker. And when they got down to the bottom, they turn the corner and they shine their light to see what's down here. And what was down there was this huge cellar that was full of scrap metal. There was metal all over the ground, and then there were also these shelves that went as far back as their lights could shine, and on the lower shelves there were these weird square metal boxes that almost looked like briefcases. On the top shelf were 55-gallon aluminum drums, and in the brothers' experience, these drums were very, very valuable. And so they walked over to the first 55-gallon drum they saw, and they pushed it to see if it was empty. It was empty. This was a huge, huge win. And so the brothers are totally amazed. They grab this first drum, they pull it off the shelf, and they wheel it over to the base of the steps. And then they go back to get another drum off the shelf, and they reach up, they grab another empty drum, and as they're pulling it off, it dislodges another 55-gallon drum that was full of some liquid, so it weighed 500 pounds, and it comes crashing off the shelf, and it lands on Ivan's leg, pinning him to the ground. And immediately the two other brothers pulled the drum off of Ivan, but it was obvious there had been significant damage done to his leg. Ivan couldn't even stand up anymore. And so they decided they would leave now and they would wait for Ivan to heal up, and then they would come back and they would collect their amazing haul. And so the brothers, they reached down and they picked up whatever pieces of metal they could to just kind of stuff in their pockets. And then the two brothers supported Ivan and carried him up the stairs. And then very slowly they made their way all the way through the forest. The two brothers helped Ivan get into his house, and they put him in his bed, and then Ivan went to sleep. The next morning when Ivan got up, he was expecting to feel better, but in fact his leg felt exponentially worse. And then over the course of the next 72 hours, it just got worse and worse and worse, and so he finally decided he had to go to the hospital. And so when he gets to the hospital, the doctor asks Ivan, what happened to your leg? And Ivan would tell him that, I was in the woods and a tree fell on my leg. He didn't want to admit to trying to steal scrap metal. Right away, the doctors and nurses began administering all the treatments and things they would do do for a crush injury, but it seemed like nothing was working. Over the course of the next several days, Ivan complained endlessly of the pain in his leg getting worse and worse and worse, and the swelling was going up, and overall Ivan's health just continued to deteriorate over his stay in the hospital. And then a week after being admitted to the hospital, the doctors walked into his room and he was dead. His kidneys had just abruptly failed, and the doctors and nurses had absolutely no idea why. How could this have happened? He hurt his leg and then his kidneys failed? It didn't make any sense. But before they could get any clarity on that, they were dealt another tragedy. The beloved family dog just kind of abruptly died. It was young, it was healthy, and so once again the family's asking what's going on here. And then just a couple of days after that, Ivan's stepson came downstairs one morning complaining of feeling sick, and when his family looked at his hands, they were blistered and covered in boils and looked like he had just reached his hands into a fire or something. But he would tell his family, I didn't do that. I don't know what's going on with my hands. I don't know why I feel so sick. And so the family rushed the boy to the hospital. Over the course of this initial discussion with doctors, the boy would tell them that over the last couple of days, he had been sifting through his stepfather, Ivan's possessions, and he had actually been using some of Ivan's tools from his toolbox. Now, the doctors were already aware of the strangeness around Ivan's death, and so the doctors knew something was off. And so on a hunch, they contacted the authorities and they told them what they thought. And then later that day, the authorities showed up at Ivan's family's house, and when they got out of the car, they were covered head to toe in white hazardous materials suits, and they marched into the family home, and immediately all their equipment led them to Ivan's toolbox, the same one the boy had been handling over the past couple of days. And when they opened that up, they discovered one strange piece of scrap metal. It was the only piece of scrap metal that Ivan had grabbed off the floor of that cellar and tucked in his pocket. And then after Ivan had passed away, his stepson had been going through his things and he had discovered this piece of scrap metal. And for whatever reason, he had transferred it from the jacket to Ivan's toolbox. What Ivan and his family didn't know was that that piece of metal was extremely dangerous. It came from an abandoned nuclear waste storage facility. That is what Ivan and his brothers had snuck onto. But because Ivan and his brothers had hopped over that side fence, they didn't see any of the warning signs that are posted on the front of the front gates telling people to stay back. Inside that cellar that the brothers were in, those small metal briefcase looking things on the lower shelves were shields for radiation. Inside of each of them was radioactive metal. And when that full 55-gallon drum came crashing off the shelf and smashed into Ivan's leg, it smashed into one of those metal briefcases and broke it open, sending the radioactive metal inside of it flying out, and it landed right next to Ivan on the ground. Ivan unfortunately grabbed one piece, and it was the radioactive one. By the time Ivan finally got back to his house, he was actually already dead. He just didn't know it yet. That piece of metal had been inside of his jacket pocket, and it had been pressed against his body long enough that he had been dealt a fatal dose of radiation. There was nothing anybody could have done, even if they knew what had happened to him. As for the dog, it used to sleep on Ivan's jacket, and it did so when this piece of scrap metal was inside of it, and so it too died of radiation poisoning. As for Ivan's stepson, that was just from his brief exchange of touching the piece of scrap metal and then putting it in Ivan's toolbox. When the doctors considered the strangeness of Ivan's death, the dog's death, and now this boy's symptoms, they did suspect radiation poisoning, and so that was how the authorities were able to get to their house and very quickly locate that toolbox. Amazingly, Ivan's stepson and the rest of Ivan's family, including his two brothers, would make full recoveries. However, several months after this event, the grandmother would suddenly die, and so even though it was not officially cited as having been caused by radiation, many people believe it's from the exposure she had to this piece of scrap metal. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.